Thank you very much. Zakiya.
Well, what I say.
What I say.
You say what I say? Say that around my mother, and that would be like cursing. Because my mother was born a year or two before Ray Charles, and she is a woman of her time and her context in Leominster, Massachusetts, who married another son of that area. My people go back in this state, as long as the Pilgrims were here. My mother's people came as indentured servants, black indentured servants. My father's came as slaves. I laugh because, of course, there was some classic disagreement about that, who had it worse and who knew better. But one of the things that I want to tell you is that when my mother was about 3 years old, it is said that she was dancing along a retaining wall in Leominster, Massachusetts, and she was just frolicking along, being a little girl. And her older cousin came and, Cousin Rob is said to have said to her, "Beverly, where is your dignity? A colored girl has to have dignity. Get off of that wall." She was 3 or 4 years old. So it's makes perfect sense to me that when I started clamoring around about what I say, it had to go. There was no room in my mama's house for anything other than standard English, because I might catch it and never be able to rise up in society.
Really a powerful point. And Ray Charles crystallized that and the black dialect. And I want my students who've been in my history class know that I talk about this. Linguists like J.L. Dillard and others talk about how any group learns a language in terms of their native tongue. So if you're a Spanish speaker and you're being taught English, you look at English through the eyes of a person who grew up speaking Spanish. So when I was in public school, we would get many American kids who would laugh at the Latino kid who would say, "Ooh, teacher, I broke my pants," because the way in which the verb was used made all the difference in terms of whether you broke, ripped, cut, what have you. And so with Africans, most Americans of African descent, 90% of us can trace our DNA back to West Africa. Most West African languages do not end words in double consonants. So when we were being exposed to English and we saw mother, father, sister, brother, we made it mother, father, sister, brother, and we took the ER and made it an A. Now, unfortunately, African Americans, not knowing that linguistical law, internalized it in a negative way because the society had rendered us as stupid and irrelevant. And so therefore they chastised their children and said, "Don't speak like that. What I say. Don't do that because the majority community will punish you for it." And so we didn't give the same credence to dialect as we give to schedule and schedule. That all of a sudden, for us, it wasn't a matter of schedule and schedule. It was a matter of being ignorant. It was a matter of not being able to learn. So that's a very powerful point Zakiya has made. And Ray Charles was one of the masters of taking black dialect, African-centered dialect, and elevating it universally. And we know that when Billie Holiday sang, "God bless the," she didn't say "God bless the child," she said "God bless the child." We know that Marvin Gaye didn't sing, "I do this to my students," they always laugh. He didn't sing, "Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, brother, brother." He wouldn't have done that. That would have been inappropriate. I'm going to skip to Leah and leave the doctor for last because I want to pose a question to him. Yes, Leah, we'll go to you.
Hi, good morning again. My name is Leah Randolph. And, when I think of Ray Charles, actually, I didn't talk about this when we were talking earlier, but I thought about my grandfather, who used to have a favorite song that he would play, Jimmy Smith's Hobo Flats. And so I was a young dancer, you know, I was one of those kids that I started dancing because I was in a car accident and I was paralyzed from the waist down. And and started to dance as a result of that, because my mom didn't have enough money for me to be able to go to dance class. So I think that was a divine intervention for that to start. But I remember dancing and organizing my family in the summertime or down the Cape around Ray Charles music and the music of Jimmy Smith and all of those greats. But I also think about Ray Charles in comparison to some of the other artists that I've worked with, like Alvin Ailey. You know, and I thought about Alvin Ailey and Louis Johnson, who choreographed the Wiz movie, and George Faison, and many great artists that were all controlled by the civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is that as artists, we were allowed to only go so far. We weren't allowed to pass through the doors. We were allowed to perform in places, even in the 80s and 90s. We were allowed to perform in places, but we weren't allowed to walk in the front door. And I think about Ray Charles and his addiction, and I think about Alvin Ailey dying from alcohol abuse, and I think about myself as an artist who went through my own experiences with drugs and alcohol. And I think about the many, Sammy Davis Jr. and the many great artists that I work with. And I think the common thread for all of us was being black in America and not being able to express yourself as an artist in the way that you felt the passion. And also being an artist in America and always being concerned about the fact that you could lose your song or your dance or your movement or your written word to someone else who could take control over it, and there was absolutely nothing that you could do about it, that you would never be paid for that. And I think the last thing that I just want to express is also being an artist and there's a shyness, you know, and there's a part of us that's probably very withdrawn and very much a part of our art and just being a part of that art. And then looking at these the things that kind of make us, when we're on stage, being on stage and being in the studio and performing, you know, you're there 100%, and you feel that energy and that excitement, and you don't feel alone. But then you have to go off the stage, and the lights go off, and the cameras are off, and now you're the same person who is feeling very withdrawn and very alone. And I think during those times, and even in today's world, you know, as artists, we always have to be careful of those seductions. And so the seductions of drugs and alcohol made it easier to be able to communicate with people and to be able to talk about yourself as an artist and to be able to feel like you fit in and to be able to feel like you were a part of, and it was seductive and it was easy. But then at a certain point it changed, and no longer were you in control of that, but it began to control you. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, I want you, well, that's my segue now. We're going to get to the meat and the potatoes of this session. As I said, if we're going to cover Ray Charles, we need to cover every aspect of Ray Charles's life. He is a giant in the American musical world. He's a giant also in terms of the fact that at one point in America, before we had President Barack Obama or others, blacks were not elected to political office, so they could not represent their communities and Latinos. And so we had to depend on athletes and artists to be the ones that went to Washington, D.C. To advocate for communities of color. Now, for all of you students here today, as you see this panel, there's no way around it or through it. If you're going to talk about pop music or contemporary music or country music, or the blues, or jazz, you're going to have to deal with the historical and sociological impact that institutional racism and sexism played in the fact that many people of color and women had no access. My students know that I stress a woman named Dorothy Donegan, who Leonard Feathers, who wrote the Encyclopedia for Jazz, says was probably the best jazz pianist of our time. And he knew he was saying that. when he said it, and Eric, I'd like you later on to address this. He knew that he was putting her at relative. She was the protege of Art Tatum. She said when asked about it, I play slower than Horowitz and faster than Tatum. That was her way that she described part of it. But I want to go to the doctor now and say, why would we have a discussion on Ray Charles and entertain his drug and alcohol abuse or any substance abuse or other abuses or addictive behavior that people may have? Is this the kind of thing that's appropriate? Do we, in fact, kind of detract from his legacy?
Actually, it's quite the contrary. You used the word earlier when you said that people were afraid to bring this up because they were afraid that it might not be wholesome. And I want to talk about being wholesome, but being wholesome in the context of a 360-degree picture of what genius really is. It's absolutely clear that Ray Charles had genius, and there are so many who have genius. But this is not a description of the dark side. This is a description of the real side. The whole reality, 360 degrees of who this man really is. And everyone in this audience probably shares one critical thing, and here's what I want to talk about. Genius, being gifted. We heard that, band. You guys really rocked it out. You really socked it. And it was so really clear that you're gifted. So thank God for that. We are really so blessed to have you. But I'm going to say something. 360 degrees, the whole picture.
Come on.
Genius is one step ahead of madness.
Oh, boy.
All right? Genius is one step ahead of madness. Okay? So you're gifted, and there's a vulnerability there. And that's where we have to describe the whole picture, 360 degrees, and what to do about that vulnerability. And I will leave 3 words with you: balance, harmony, and synchronizing. Balance, harmony, and synchronizing. So I'll get back to that, but that's what we're going to talk about to offer as a response to the vulnerability that gifted genius has.
Dr. Lloyd Sheldon.
We talked about, earlier, we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I think about the young men, I've worked primarily with young African-American and Latino men, and I've done a lot of research on maleness. And I think that it's very, very important as artists, especially as Dr. White mentioned, as geniuses, to keep in mind that your ego can be that one thing that will give you fuel and catapult you to greatness, but it can also be that thing that will destroy you. So as was mentioned earlier, when you're in those quiet moments and you're by yourself and you know, you have no one there to give you the support you need, a lot of people will turn to that bottle, they will turn to that crack pipe, they will turn to that line of Coke or a half a bag of weed to try to get them through whatever it is they need to get through in order to feel good about who they are. And as Dr. White said, I always try to impress upon the guys, it's very, very important for you every day to have some kind of quiet time where you can sit and meditate, where you can have clear and realistic goals. These guys, a lot of them who are like 18, 19 years old may have some vision of playing for the NBA or the NFL. I mean, that may not happen. So have a realistic goal. Because if your game is not all that, you're not going there. You know, so be clear about that so that you don't end up with some crack pipe trying to fantasize about how you are playing ball with the Celtics when you know you can't even, your game is not even good enough to get you out of Roxbury or Dorchester, you know. So be clear and be realistic about your goals. The other thing, I think that you have to exercise all of your senses every day, and you have to find a way to integrate your mind, your body, and your spirit. And these things are very, very challenging, especially if you have the challenge of being African American, you have the challenge of being a female, you have the challenge of having some alternative lifestyle. You need to really, really be grounded so that you will not be destroyed by these addictions.